Ennard is like if the Mimic had better branding, right?
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs, the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host with the toast, Ryan Toast, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's, like we always do. This episode's a little late. We're in the middle of a week of very good news, but very busy news. I'll have more to talk about that probably next week, but just so you know, streams are still not happening for probably another couple weeks, and I'm very busy, but, the horrors persist, and so must we, so we got to make sure to still do this, this podcast, this channel, the stuff that I love doing, the stuff that puts food on my table, and the like. As far as today's episode goes, I had a couple things I wanted to talk about, but I got a lot of questions from, let me see. So, hey, full transparency, it was a 5-hour live stream. I've been incredibly busy this week. I have not been able to watch it yet. And this isn't a dig at the video or the live stream. I love these people, and I'm sure it's a very good and informative live stream. But I've gotten a lot of questions about the topic of it, so I want to throw my hat in the ring. That being said, it was Gibby's Horror Homestead, a friend of the channel, who had Unwithered Truth, friend of the channel, on, and they had a stream titled Tossing FNAF Lore in the Trash Because We're Insane, and the thumbnail said, There is no Cassidy. Now, granted, again, this isn't necessarily responding to their stream, because I didn't watch it. I haven't had the time. And also, they're not the first people to say that Cassidy doesn't exist. One of the things about FNAF that is so interesting and has so many of us doing all these theories about it is that everything we know about Five Nights at Freddy's is speculation. Very, very, very little information in FNAF is direct and confirmed. Almost everything is speculative, or, it's side context that implies something, or even when we do get direct information, we can't trust our narrators, right? Help Wanted introduced an unreliable narrator for the first 7 games. Ruin, for the majority of Ruin, we're playing as somebody who has their vision augmented. For the majority of Secret of the Mimic, we're playing as somebody who hasn't slept in 36 hours, who, can we trust his vision? It's the thing where, unfortunately, there's very, 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 very little information we can take at face value in Five Nights at Freddy's. Pretty much all of it is up for interpretation, and because of that, pretty much every theory is in some way valid, as is Cassidy doesn't exist. But I am going to throw my hat in the ring here and say that Cassidy does, in fact, exist. So why am I so sure that Cassidy exists? Because my entire channel, I've been very gung-ho that Cassidy is the vengeful spirit. That's one of the theories that I've always been very attached to. I've very much leaned into it. There was a moment, especially before Secret of the Mimic came out, where I was definitely more open to Fazbear Frights being in the game's canon. And I do think, admittedly, if Fazbear Frights is in the game's canon, then Andrew pretty handedly has to be the vengeful spirit. So for me, my thinking and my framework of this entire series has always been less that it is important to prove Cassidy with beyond a doubt is the vengeful spirit, but the argument more so is, are you arguing that the Fazbear Frights short stories, or at least the Stitch Wraith related short stories, exist within the game's timeline? Because if they don't, most of the evidence we have, I would argue, suggests that Cassidy is the vengeful spirit, not the crying child, which we'll get into. Counter to that, if you think it's more likely that the Fazbear Fright stories, or at least the Stitch Wraith related Fazbear Fright stories, are in the timeline, then Andrew pretty much has to be the vengeful spirit. So I don't think that Fazbear Frights are. I don't think that the Fazbear Fright short stories are in the timeline. So that being said, I don't think it's Andrew. I think that's a shorter conversation, so we'll have that one first. So I kind of went over this very quickly. For anyone who doesn't know, Fazbear Frights, series of short stories that was released for Five Nights at Freddy's. All of the books, except for the last 2, which I don't think had epilogues, but most of the Fazbear Frights stories, books, would have 3 short stories and an epilogue. And the epilogue was a part of a continuing story across all of the volumes of Fazbear Frights. So it was 3 short stories and then a piece of what has been known as the Stitch Wraith Stingers, the epilogues at the back that form one cohesive story. And as you read those epilogues, it involves several of the Fazbear Frights stories. So you could argue that like half of Fazbear Frights is directly related to the Stitch Wraith. The question is the Stitch Wraith and its related stories, are those in the game's timeline? On the surface, there's not much to say that they can't be, because the vast majority of these Fazbear Fright stories take place pretty much in the like early 2000s. And none of them really ever directly relate to any FNAF game. They're all at least in some way related to Fazbear as a company and an idea, but very, very, very rarely is there ever a mention of any of the games. I don't think there is one, like, directly. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, and then I went to the Fazbear Fright horror attraction and the night guard looked kind of weird. Like, they don't talk about it at all. It's related stories. It's the effects that this Freddy's brand has on the things around in the world. I think the closest we get is Coming Home, which I think you could argue is about the Chica that is the FNAF 1 Chica. Because, you know, I'm pretty sure her name is Susie. Yeah, because a girl named Susie is possessed by Chica. So, right. But for the most part, very, very, very rarely does any direct FNAF mentions come up. So the reason that people argue that these stories take place during the FNAF timeline is twofold. One, again, there's not much to directly go against the games. So for the most part, it slots in pretty easily. And it's like, why not? This is, material of this expanded universe that helps flesh out the world in a way that does not disrupt the games. Cool. There's one thing, however, that directly would interact with the games and would answer a question many of us have. That's the vengeful spirit. Because in one of the Fazbear Fright short stories, The Man in Room 1280, it follows a story of William Afton being sent to a hospital. Now, I don't think it's ever directly said, like, this is William Afton. I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong there. It's one that I need to reread. I think it's next on my reread. But it's this living corpse, essentially, incredibly burnt, should not be alive, skin is basically translucent, he's in such a bad shape, but somehow he's alive. And they're getting to a point where they're like, well, we'll put him out of his misery, but they can't kill him. They're like, anytime they get close, this like ghost of a small boy in an alligator mask scares them away, or something like that happens, and like no one's able to put him out of his misery. And, one of the doctors notices that it seems that there's 2 consciousnesses in his brain, which is weird, right? There's all this weirdness around this corpse. Like, what is this thing? And then eventually a priest gets through to him where he's noticing that his, one of the fingers is able to trace out letters, and it was either Morse code or like spelling in the air. But he's able to spell out an abbreviated version of like Fazbear equipment distribution or something like that, right? Like a nearby Fazbear warehouse. So the priest is like, hey, it's a breakthrough. Maybe if I get this guy there, we'll get some answers as to who this guy is. Maybe we can help him. Maybe he can finally rest and die. I don't know. It's worth a shot. So he throws him in a wheelchair, sneaks him out of the hospital, and he takes him down to that Fazbear warehouse. The moment he gets in that Fazbear warehouse, the body basically combusts. It basically like shudder, and then just black goop explodes in a 360 radius, getting on top and getting on like a bunch of old Fazbear merchandise. And the priest is like, Santa Maria, this is awful, right? So that is the entirety of the story of The Man in Room 1280. Like, the story pretty much ends there. And it's like a weird story, right? Like, it doesn't really have a great beginning or ending. It's just like this snippet of, it feels like a snippet of a grander story. That's because it is. Because in the Stitch Wraith Stingers, we eventually meet two spirits who are possessing what is known as the Stitch Wraith, which is this endoskeleton with a weird mask, a battery in its chest, and it was pumped full of agony by somebody trying to study the effects of agony, which is, you know, the worst human emotion, the energy of that emotion. I guess I gotta explain agony before we even get into the Stitch Wraith. So essentially, there's a scientist in one of the Fazbear epilogues, and his whole goal is that he's in the business of emotional energy. And, you know, he it's his belief that emotions carry their own energies, and he believes the strongest emotion, the strongest energy is agony. He's been able to observe this energy under specific light, and it's his hypothesis that if something tragic or awful enough happens nearby, if something awful or tragic happens, and if it's horrible enough and the victim feels enough agony in that moment, their emotions can infect nearby objects. And this is his hypothesis for the explanation for what is known as haunted objects, where like a clock seems to be haunted or something. It's this agony that persists. And it's his further hypothesis that if you take something and like impose enough agony onto that object and infuse it with an intelligence, even an artificial intelligence, you could theoretically create life. So that's his hypothesis. So to test this, he takes an old endoskeleton. He affixes a battery from, he takes his old endoskeleton, puts it up, and then the rest of this experiment has been collecting agonizing, like, haunted objects or objects that were near tragedies. One of them was a fetch dog, which is a dog from one of the Fazbear Fright stories, which he takes the battery out of and puts it into the chest. One of them is this like weird paper mask thing that he puts on the face. It was like the mask of a doll. And then he takes these agony objects next to the endoskeleton and uses his science machine thing. It's like the details aren't really specified, but something that's able to take the agony of one object and push it into the next. The idea being taking the agony from the smallest object, putting it into the next one, and then all that, putting it into the next one, and then all that, putting all that agony into the endoskeleton and seeing if it works. So that's kind of what he does. He does this and then energizes the endoskeleton and it stands up. He was right. He formed something out of agony and consciousness that's able to essentially live. And as he's like, I did it, it worked, it reaches out to touch him, and he instantly dies. He like shrivels up like a grape and falls to the ground. And now we have the Stitch Wraith, something we have to deal with. That endoskeleton being called the Stitch Wraith. The rest of the stories kind of follow the Stitch Wraith and what it's doing next. And we learn that there's actually two souls in this Stitch Wraith. There's the soul Jake and Andrew. So Jake is able to maneuver the Stitch Wraith and control it and able to see the outside world. Andrew is not able to see anything, not able to hear anything, and not able to control the Stitch Wraith. However, it's his thinking that it's his agony that's killing things. Like when they touched the scientist and he instantly died, that was Andrew's doing. So Jake and Andrew are kind of trying to talk to each other to figure out what happens now. And Andrew tells us that he tells us that he was really angry at a specific man, and he can't remember why. But he wanted him to suffer as long as possible. And then eventually, he remembers his agony. He wanted it, like in the moment, he wanted it everywhere. So he remembered getting it on everything. But so then Jake is like, well, that's awful. We have to go and collect your agony to fix this. So then they do that. Throughout the next couple short story endings, the Stitch Wraith goes and collects those things that Andrew had infected with his agony, and we find out more and more of these objects are the possessed objects we see in the Fazbear Frights short stories. So, like, you know, if there's a haunted doll in one of the stories, the epilogues are kind of showing, like, oh, Andrew's agony was infecting it, so they are going to collect it so it doesn't hurt anybody else. You know, and as they're doing this, there's a moment where Jake almost moves on and realizes Andrew can't, so he stops. And the thinking being like Andrew will not be able to move on until all of him is collected. So they keep doing this, and eventually, once it's all collected and all in a garbage, just like a trash compactor, they throw themselves in. They're like, we did it. We'll throw ourselves in, and hopefully, reforming Andrew, we can both move on. But it's in that moment when the whole like collected mass of agony trash starts to shake and morph into this giant rabbit mecha thing. And William Afton's voice essentially is like, thanks for collecting me, boys. I am the agony. And it's this reveal that like maybe, some of that agony was Andrew's, but the real like sick and twisted agony throughout everything was most likely actually William Afton's. The story goes on from there, but the important thing is that knowing all of this, the man in room 1280 seems to be the setup for this, right? Where we have this old, evil, like, and it's very stressed. It's stressed a lot in Man in Room 1280 that the corpse feels evil, right? So we have this evil old man, like corpse thing that's alive somehow, and a little boy who won't let anybody kill him. This little boy ghost who stops people from killing him. And, we get Andrew, like, I wanted him to suffer as long as possible. So it's like, okay. And then we get this old man who explodes over a bunch of Fazbear merch. And then we have these stories of, oh, my agony is spread amongst all of this Fazbear merch that we have to go collect. So the line is pretty one-to-one there. And the thinking is that the man in room 1280 sees William Afton's body with Andrew attached to it explode over all these, like, pieces of merchandise. And eventually, Andrew and Jake go to collect those pieces in the epilogues. Why did I just explain all of this? Well, if you believe that Fazbear Fright's short stories are in the game's timeline and in the game's universe, that's Ultimate Custom Night, right? Not the collection part, but the stuff that happens before. The idea of a small child's soul who is so angry at William Afton that it wants to prolong and keep William Afton alive to torture him for as long as possible. That's like exactly Ultimate Custom Night, right? Like we get all these lines where it's like, they tried to burn us, they tried to have us, they tried to kill us, but I will keep you here. I will not let you go. I will keep us here forever. The ending of Ultimate Custom Night is Golden Freddy twitching and fading into the distance to imply that it will be there for eternity. And then there's the whole thing about the one you should not have killed. He is watching. Andrew's a boy. There's connections to Andrew and Golden Freddy. Andrew has curly black hair, and in one of the stories that deals with Golden Freddy, a teenager reaches in and swears they see and or feel curly black hair. The idea that, okay, the vengeful spirit in this scenario died in the Golden Freddy suit, which is why Golden Freddy's appearing in Ultimate Custom Night. It's why Golden Freddy can't be killed, and if you try, Fredbear kills you. If the Fazbear Fright stories are in the game's universe, this is a pretty open and shut case that Andrew is the vengeful spirit. But are they? I don't think so. Frankly, my main issue with this is the man in room 1280. Because for all of this to work, William Afton's body would have need to be taken out of the FNAF 6 location. And that just doesn't make sense to me, right? Because we have FNAF 6, where William Afton, or what's left of him, inside of the Spring Bonnie suit, is burnt away forever. And the whole building burns to the ground. Everyone burns, and it's supposed to all be a mess. And then you cut to, however long later, 10, 20, 30 years later, and Security Breach, where you go down and you see that old pizzeria bunker, and there's a Spring Bonnie suit that's burnt to a crisp with the remains of a human inside of it. So, like, Spring Bonnie with a human body in it burns down. And then in the same location, we find a burnt corpse of Spring Bonnie with human remains in it. Like, it's so direct. It's so one-to-one. And, there are arguments for this. There's the argument that what is Burn Trap? Security Breach's handling of all of its lore is very messy because Scott did not tell Steelwool what the lore was supposed to be. So what even is Burn Trap? Is Burn Trap a hallucination? Maybe. Because I've made the point in the past too that like another issue with the Man in Room 1280 is William Afton is a whole body without an animatronic suit. And that's an issue, right? because even if you want to say that Burntrap isn't William Afton's corpse, we have FNAF 6, where where William Afton is essentially a skeleton with guts attached to him, fused with a metal suit. So you're going to have to argue that either, and notably in Man in Room 1280, a suit is never once mentioned. The paramedics bring him to the hospital as a body. So you all have to argue that either paramedics get to the scene, they delve in, they find Spring Bonnie, and then they take the suit off of him perfectly and just get the corpse inside and then realize it's alive and bring it to the hospital, or that the fire was so hot that it perfectly melted the entirety of Spring Bonnie away from William Afton, but did not disintegrate the organs and bones inside of it. Neither of those, there's so, like, again, we're talking about Five Nights at Freddy's. It's a game franchise where there's haunted animatronics. But, like, there's some internal logic sometimes, dude. Not to mention, the whole thing about Man in Room 1280, he's got skin. He's got translucent skin. He's like a body that's almost fully burnt away, but he's got this weird semi-translucent skin. Scrap Trap is a skeleton with organs attached to it. There's no skin on Scrap Trap. Am I wrong in this? Like, Scrap Trap is just an animatronic that you can see the bones and organs underneath of. There's no skin there. He literally needs skin. Because then if you take off, if you wanted to argue, they're like, oh, it's just a design thing. There's, even if you took off the animatronic suit, you'd have a skeleton with organs affixed to it. What are we talking about here? So again, I just do not see a world where the Man in Room 1280 makes sense in the game's timeline. And because of that, none of the stitch right really works. Like, unless you want to argue that something like the Man in Room 1280 happened, and then something like they recovered the body and tried to revive him and he ends up exploding and all of this stuff happens. Sure, but we have no evidence to suggest that. I would need some in-game evidence to suggest that that's even a possibility. We have no evidence that points us in that direction. I see no reason to go that way. So, Andrew aside, we still need to figure out who the vengeful spirit is. I think once you ex-nay the books, Cassidy is the only worthwhile option here. Because we need a person who is so vindictive against William Afton, more than anyone else, that they are willing to sacrifice their own afterlife to spend the rest of eternity tormenting William Afton. And the reason why Cassidy works as a character is because every other victim hates William Afton and wants to kill him, but anytime he dies, that victim wants to move on. So we need to find out a victim who would be particularly pissed at William Afton. And we know from Ultimate Custom Night that person is related to Golden Freddy in some way, because the ending of the game where Golden Freddy twitches into the distance. So a lot of people say it's Cassidy. Now, where does the name Cassidy comes from? That's the security logbook, the activity book that was released around like 5 years ago at this point. And in it, there's a puzzle throughout the entire thing where there's this text in the book asking questions, and sometimes the book of the text answers it. But that like faded text that's written in the book that's asking these questions will also write my name several times throughout the book. And on those pages, the page numbers are wrong. Or there's some other number that you can point out from those pages. Somebody took that all together, charted it out on the word search, and got the name Cassidy. So whoever is trying to assist this like spirit in remembering anything, their name is Cassidy. And then, just process of elimination. We know most other names in this series. The only names we really don't know is the Crying Child and the Vengeful Spirit. The Crying Child. So that's where the Crying Child thing comes in, where a lot of people went, okay, that's the name of the Crying Child, because the Vengeful Spirit, could be anybody. The Vengeful Spirit could be one of the Missing Child Incident kids. Who knows, right? So people went, Vengeful Spirit, who cares? The Crying Child, their name is Cassidy. Well, it's plausible. I would say, like, that is a theory you can go down. I prefer BarBADroid's interpretation of the security logbook, which gets us the name Dave for the crying child. And, you know, one of my issues with the crying child being the vengeful spirit is characterization. The whole point of the vengeful spirit is it's so angry and so vindictive and so vengeful that it's willing to spend the rest of eternity torturing William Afton. The crying child in every iteration, every scene, every interpretation of this character we've ever seen is a wet blanket kid who cries and does nothing else. So the fact that he turns into the vengeful spirit doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally, unless he has a lot of character growth off screen. But something that I think a lot of us need to take into account is that the thing with Five Nights at Freddy's is, since we have so little information about any of these characters, massive changes to their character, for the most part, need to be shown in some way. If we have this kid who their entire character trait is they are a whiny bitch, the idea that off screen and never mentioned once they turn into the most vindictive, angry, vengeful character in the series, I need some evidence. I've got no evidence. So then we go back to, well, who else is related to Golden Freddy? And I have a whole video on this a while ago about, like, Golden Freddy and drowning, because Golden Freddy is loosely associated several times with drowning. There's the FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Old Man Consequences sequences where our Freddy or Fredbear's sprite, it's disputed who it is, forces itself into the lake and drowns, right? We have the story of drowning from Tales of the Pizzaplex, which tells of a girl who's haunting this digital water park, and she had drowned in some way. I think it's implied in a bathtub, but there's a moment where she is related somewhat to Princess, where the main character says that she used to play Rescue the Princess, and it reminds her of this girl. It's like, interesting, when in Princess Quest, the princess at one point had a file name of Cassidy, which was taken down, but, you know, it's worth mentioning. But then you look at Special Delivery, and the custom skin for Golden Freddy in the Dark Circus DLC was, I think, Escape Artist Freddy or Great Escape Freddy, Golden Freddy. And it was a chained up Golden Freddy inside of a tank of water, drowning. You look at Security Breach, and we have this giant golden statue of Glamrock Freddy, but in Ruin, it's chained up and taken to the ground. So we get a lot of loose associations with Golden Freddy and drowning. And in that video, I make the connection that in The Silver Eyes, William Afton describes being killed by Springlocks as drowning in your own blood. He describes it as, you know, it punctures you everywhere, it hurts like hell, and you end up drowning in your own blood. So, like, you know, we get more and more information here. We get the idea that in the Fall Fest of '83 lobby in Help Wanted, Dreadbear exits a red lake. Where we have all these images of Golden Freddy entering a red lake, and Dreadbear, this dark, agony-coded version of it, exits a lake on the other side, right? So I put all this together to say that the reason the vengeful spirit is so vengeful and is so angry is because, unlike the other victims of William Afton, who I think were killed and then stuffed into animatronic suits, I think the argument here is that whoever the vengeful spirit was a victim of William Afton who was put into the Fredbear suit and had the spring locks activated, killing them inside. Spring locks which are known to be one of the most agonizing deaths in the series, especially if you're a child who doesn't fit the suit correctly. Right? Like, if spring locks pierce you all over your body and, like, your head is just left to be on top and dead, if you're a child who's, like, 3 foot tall, that's gonna hurt way more because you're in this suit that, like, doesn't fit you right. Your head might still be in the suit. Like, that's gotta be awful. And this awful, agonizing, horrible death creates the vengeful spirit, creates this thing that is so aggressive and angry towards William Afton. And we even have an in-universe explanation for why the vengeful spirit is attached to William Afton in the first place. That comes from Stormister, who put out a theory a couple years back where the reason why Springtrap and Scraptrap look so different is because after FNAF 3, but before FNAF 6, William Afton seeks out the old Fredbear suit and uses parts of it to repair himself, because they were made around the same time, made with the same technology. And part of this theory is that there are parts of Fredbear that look like parts of Scraptrap. But if William Afton did that, then the vengeful spirit who's possessing the Golden Freddy suit would be literally affixed to William Afton, which would then lead into Ultimate Custom Night. The idea that William Afton took parts of the vengeful spirit and attached it to himself. So now the vengeful spirit is a part of William Afton and able to torture him forever. So all this to say, if we have all of this information, and we have one name floating around, that being Cassidy, which never really gets explained well, there's one more kicker that I think helps attach Cassidy to all of this. And that is the movie script drafts. Back before the first FNAF movie, William Afton, God forbid. Back before the first FNAF movie, Scott Cawthon was made a post saying that they picked a script and filming was starting soon. It was a really hype post. But part of that was the way he led into it was listing all of the scripts they didn't go for. And they all had a code name. And one of them was codenamed the Cassidy script. And the description was something for the lore heads that would have made them very happy, but it was too dense for the general public to follow. Which means, by Scott Cawthon's own admission, the name Cassidy encapsulates a script about the lore. Like, it seems so specific. And the idea of this name that's floating around that Scott Cawthon himself admits is relevant to the lore being attached to this vengeful spirit, it just makes sense. So, like everything in Five Nights at Freddy's, is Cassidy definitively guaranteed to be a real character? No. Because, hey, guess what? The name Cassidy never once said in game. Never once said in any of the games. But hey, frankly, neither is Henry Emily. William Afton is said in William Afton is said in the credits of FNAF 6. We at least get Mr. Afton in Sister Location, so I don't know. I think it makes the most sense that Cassidy is the vengeful spirit for all the reasons I've listed. Are you allowed to think other things? Of course. I'm actually, once I get time, I can't wait to watch this live stream because I'd love to know what they think. Because there are other ways to interpret it. When I tried to make the non-book games only FNAF timeline, I settled on Michael Afton being the vengeful spirit. Which I don't think is true, but you can argue your way there. It's the really fun thing about Five Nights at Freddy's is because there's so much loose information, you can make like 17 different fully evidence-backed timelines, and they can all be valid and possible. So I would say that pretty much any theory I've seen for the vengeful spirit is valid. I just personally believe it's Cassidy for the reasons I've stated. And I think now's a good time to move on to questions. So if you had your questions you want answered, send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That's in the description, copy and paste, because it's paid to type out. It doesn't have to be just about FNAF, by the way. But, it probably will be, and that's okay. Our first question comes from Steph, she, her. There are so many animatronics in the FNAF franchise, some that have come back in the Steel Wool era, and others that have not. What are animatronics you would like to see make a comeback in the future? For me, I think some of the sister location animatronics like Ballora are so cool, and it would be awesome to see a glam rock version of her, or perhaps a fixed version of Ennard. Thank you for your question. I think you're right to say that sister location is the one I would want to see more of. Now, granted, we did just get a lot of it in Help Wanted 2, right? Like, Help Wanted 2 gave us the Ballora minigame, Funtime Freddy minigame, the Circus Baby Spotlight, so we are getting sister location animatronics, but I would say what I always say with questions like this, and that's that I think Ennard is the most squandered opportunity Five Nights at Freddy's had. Ennard is like if the Mimic had better branding, right? Because, look, I love the Mimic as a character, but as a design, I would argue it's not very recognizable. To us FNAF fans it is, because, that's the Mimic. I recognize that build, I recognize those eyes, but to the general public, it kind of just looks like an endoskeleton. right? Whereas Ennard had that mask for like recognizability. I think that's why people latch onto Jackie arguably more than the Mimic, because she's recognizable. But Ennard was such a perfect antagonist because he was A, fucking terrifying, B, recognizable, and C, had something that no other FNAF animatronic ever did. And that was psychological horror, in the idea that I'm still obsessed with the office fight at the end of Sister Location, where partway through, Circus Baby stops, or Ennard stops using the Circus Baby voice, and knowing it's up against Michael Afton, starts using Elizabeth Afton's, the dead child, his dead sister, uses her voice to try to manipulate us to let him in. That's awesome. That's such good horror. That's smart horror. I have a whole video on the channel. It's quite old now. I don't even remember if the video's any good, to be honest with you. But I have a whole video talking about how Ennard is like the best that FNAF gets horror-wise. The idea of these animatronics using the voices of the dead people that possess it against the living. That's so smart. It's so well done. And it's something I wish we could see more of. Like, Ennard is such a creepy antagonist, especially how fluid it is. Right? Like, Ennard is this weird amalgamation of wires and endoskeleton. It can very likely just, like, slurp through stuff. It's probably why Ennard's in the vent minigame. So the idea that we have this amazing antagonist who appears for exactly 30 seconds of the entire franchise sucks. I want more Ennard. I've always said my ideal FNAF game, or I guess FNAF fan game if you want to be it that way, is you're just a random suburban kid trying to get home on a late night, and there's been like rumors about some cryptid or whatever, and you find out on your way home it's Ennard. Ennard is loose in your neighborhood, and you have to avoid him on the way back home. Right, because we get that thing where like Ennard escapes into the sewers and it's just loose. And the idea of like, you know, like you're hiding in the bushes with a flashlight and you hear just this metal scraping on dirt as it like slithers past. That's awesome. I think that's really cool. And I just don't think we're ever going to get it. I think we're just past Ennard. I don't think it makes sense to bring Ennard back. So we'd have to get a game that comes out after Sister Location, but before FNAF 6. And if we're getting a FNAF game in the past, I don't think that's the area I would want. So that's my thoughts on that. I think Ennard, not even a fixed version, I think Ennard as it is, getting a spotlight would be awesome. But thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Meg, she, her. In the Midnight Motorist minigame, what evidence is there to say that Crying Child is alive? Neither son seems to act like they did in the FNAF 4 minigames, Michael being a bully and Crying Child being a coward. Why would Michael, as some people theorize to the person in front of the TV to be sympathetic towards his brother? Why would Crying Child / Dave be smashing windows and escaping? This isn't very consistent with how they were portrayed in FNAF 4, unless this scene was post-1983. A traumatized Michael and a robot Dave. Thank you for your question. I agree and disagree with your question, essentially. So, the characterization of Michael, I think, does make sense. The characterization of the Crying Child doesn't. I personally believe that Midnight Motorist is showing us in a post-Crying Child's death world what Michael Afton was getting up to. I think it's the night before Michael Afton is put into the FNAF 4 testing chambers, essentially. Where after the death of the Crying Child, Michael Afton keeps sneaking out to visit his grave and visit the nearby lake. And he keeps doing this a lot. And William Afton gets fed up with it, and he throws him into the FNAF 4 Nightmare testing chambers to, 1, have somebody to experiment on that nobody's going to check in on, and 2, a bit of a pseudo-punishment for all the inconvenience. Or, like, even if you don't believe that FNAF 4 was built off of these testing chambers, I think that's at least when Michael Afton is moved into the FNAF 4 bedroom, a bedroom where the doors don't lock and there's no windows. Right, because William Afton's big thing is like, you don't lock this door against me, and Michael Afton broke a window to escape. So it makes sense to move him into a bedroom where the doors don't even shut, let alone lock, and there's no windows to escape from. But so as much as I agree that like it doesn't make sense for the Crying Child to break through a window and escape, I disagree on the Michael Afton being sympathetic towards his brother. I think it does make sense. I think Michael Afton being the guy on the couch if that's your interpretation, I think that makes perfect sense for his characterization. Because one, we do know for a fact, Michael Afton, he do be watching TV. Like, he do love to sit on the couch and watch some TV. So for one, that's fair. But I've seen this a bit, and I think it speaks to the complexity of abuse in households. For like, why would Michael Afton be sympathetic towards his brother? Michael Afton, all the Afton children are very clearly in an abusive household. William Afton, very clearly an abusive father, very clearly a shitty, terrible parent. Michael Afton, I very much see in the characterization, lashes out against the crying child, not because he hates the crying child. He hates that he has to take care of the crying child. William Afton is never there. When he is there, it's a bad thing. But when he's not there, somebody has to keep an eye on the crying child. And Michael Afton resents the crying child for having to be that person. I think that makes perfect sense in the logic of this. That being said, that doesn't mean he hates the crying child, and that doesn't mean he would want William Afton to go after the crying child. In the mentality of a abused child, I think it makes perfect sense to resent your younger brother, traumatize, abuse your younger brother, all of that. Not excusing it, right? I'm not excusing the behavior Michael shows to the crying child, but explaining it. Yet at the same time, when their drunken, abusive father comes home, to be like, he had a rough day, lay off him. That makes perfect sense to me. And that's just a psychology thing. That's just, a cycle of abuse thing. So I would disagree that it doesn't make sense for Michael to be the couch. I think it makes perfect sense for Michael Afton to be the person on the couch. I just don't think it makes sense for the crying child to break a window and escape. So that's why I typically have Michael be the escapee and either, Mrs. Afton or babysitter or whoever being the person on the couch. But could be a lot of things. That's my thoughts on it. Thank you for your question. I think we'll call it there. I've got a couple other questions, but I'll save them for next week, including Digital Circus. I really want to talk about that, but I'll save it for next week. So in the meantime, again, if you have any questions you want to answer on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. It's in the description to copy and paste because it's a pain to type out. But until next time, as always, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.